Hi folks, and welcome to this pre-recorded video tutorial for interactive visualization in the era of Jupyter. So this is being recorded for the Astro Hack Week 2020, happening in the end of August, beginning of September, which would have been an in-person conference, but is now virtualized. And because it's virtual and we've got people from time zones all over, the timing is such that some people are going to have to see a pre-recorded version. So I figured it'd be best just to record it for everyone and make sure that the delivery was really suited to that. And of course, because of this, we'll have the recording available in the future, and so I've tried to set it up such that it'll be useful for folks even not involved in the Astro Hack Week conference going forward. So to introduce myself, my name is Peter Williams. I'm the Innovation Scientist of the Center for Astrophysics, Harvard-Smithsonian, and the American Astronomical Society. So my background in astronomy research is mainly radio astronomy, time domain surveys, stellar and substellar magnetism. But most of what I do right now is I'm the director of the WorldWide Telescope software project at the AAS right now. So to get started, the first thing I wanted to do was to start booting up the Jupyter notebooks that we'll be using. And so Astro Hack Week has two of these, has a dedicated notebook server, but I'm also going to show a way to set it up using the mybinder.org service, which is just generally available. So if you're not affiliated with Astro Hack Week, you should be able to do everything, no problem. And these things usually take a few minutes to get started, so I'll get them going, and I'll do a little bit of introduction while that's happening. So I guess I'll start with the Astro Hack Week version. So as you hopefully have been given, we have a login on this hack.institute service. Oh, okay, so I guess my server is already running, so I don't have anything to show here, but I will show, so once it eventually boots up, it will default by taking you to, hopefully you can see this user pkgw/tree address. So this is a standard Jupyter notebook interface, but for what we're going to do, we're going to want to use Jupyter Lab, which sort of adds a more complex environment. So the way that we do that is we manually edit this URL and replace the /tree with a /lab. So once again, your server, you'll probably have to click through the screen to choose your server type and get it going, so that will take a little bit longer. So I'm not going to do anything with this right now while that happens. If you're not involved with the Hack Week, what we can do is we can go to, use this MyBinder service, so we have a short link. So it's bit.ly/PyWWT notebooks. So this is PyWWT is the Python module for WorldWide Telescope, and we have some sample notebooks. So bit.ly PyWWT-notebooks. And if I click enter on that, that will take us to the MyBinder service, and that will start loading up the thing. And again, I'll just let these go in the background and start talking a little bit about what we're doing here. So this talk and this workshop is going to be about visualization. And one thing I want to say, which probably you won't need convincing of, is that data visualization is an important part of what we do as scientists. So to elaborate on that a little bit more, one idea that I think is useful to keep in mind is we kind of have two axes that we work towards. You can talk about, we have exploratory visualization or we have explanatory visualization. So exploratory is more what you're doing when you've got a data set and you're just trying to figure out what's going on there. And then explanatory might be a little bit closer to, once you've written up a paper and got a result that you're trying to convince people of, what visualizations do you prepare to help convince people of that? And one little idea that I like to keep in mind here is we've got two maps of the London Tube. On the right up is the actual geography of the center of London, and on the bottom left is the current map that you'd see in a subway station. And there was an actual discrete moment in time when someone said, hey, you know what, it would probably be more helpful to just draw the lines as straight lines as much as we can and not try and reproduce the actual geography of London. So the top right is closer to what we'd have on the exploratory side of trying to actually understand, the map of the territory, and the explanatory version is more like what we have on the left, which is helping people get the information they need in a more targeted fashion. So most of what we'll be talking about here is on the exploratory side. But for what it's worth, obviously this is not a total hard dichotomy. Things exist on the continuum here, but there's different things that you optimize for depending on the usage. Why do we do data visualization? I really like this example. Statistics hide numbers. We all know that implicitly. The classic example that you may have heard of is something called Anscombe's quartet. Here's a little bit of an updated version that I like, where this plot is showing a bunch of data sets, all of which have the same means and standard deviations and correlation coefficients in X and Y, but obviously the actual characteristics of these data as we'd assess them as a human are extremely different. And this is why we visualize our data, because when we're in exploratory mode and we don't really know what we're looking at, we need to be able to tell the difference between these different examples that we're seeing, and the Human's Visual Processing Center is about the best thing that we have available to do that. And again, most of you probably don't need convincing of this, but data viz actually really matters. It's not just pretty pictures. So here's a plot that you might be able to tell is a little bit old from something called the Rogers Commission report. So we see here on the x-axis joint temperature as a function of air temperature, on the y-axis number of incidents. So this is a plot that people were looking at when they were trying to decide whether to launch a Challenger space shuttle in January 1986. The predicted air temperature for the launch was 36 degrees, which is well off the side of this plot here. And they looked at the number of failures as a function of temperature and said, I don't know, looks okay. Obviously, there were a lot of things that went into the Challenger disaster, but this is one thing that people did look at. Here's what this plot should have actually looked like, where before they didn't actually plot any of the flights where there were no hardware incidents. And you can see that they're all happening above air temperatures at 65 degrees. So I think when you say, hey, we should probably also include the 0 points in this visualization, suddenly you come away with an extremely different takeaway than you would before. So I think the biggest challenge in data visualization that we are facing right now is a transition from local visualization to remote visualization. As we all hear all the time, data sets are getting bigger and more complex, and network speeds are growing, but they're not growing as rapidly as data volumes are growing. And so, as we have heard many times in the context of facilities like the Vera Rubin Observatory or radio telescopes, we're not going to be able to download the data. The era of going to the data archive and saying, hey, give me observation ID number blah, and downloading it are going away. And, this is good because these data sets really are going to be incredible, but this is a big challenge. If you want to interactively visualize a data set that exists over the network somewhere, and you want to have a nice experience that feels good to a human, there's a lot of pieces you got to pull together. You need to be able to transmit data reliably. You have to have some way to build user interfaces. You need to exploit the graphics hardware on the local node. You need to be able to do computations locally. Latency is a huge thing, and so anytime that you have to go back and forth to the server, especially if your server is related to the SKA, it's the middle of the desert in Australian outback, that really kills you. So you also need identity and access management. There's just a whole stack of technologies that if you really want to build a high quality data exploration experience, you need to master. Fortunately, industry has built the software platform that we need to do this. That platform is called the web. What is Google.com besides an interactive interface to an extremely massive, complex, sophisticated database that's living somewhere else in somebody else's servers? Everything that a web browser does is the infrastructure, exactly the infrastructure that we need to build web applications that are sophisticated remote data visualizers. So this is great. Billions of dollars have been spent doing a lot of the work that we need to solve this problem. I want to really emphasize, to my mind, this is why Jupyter is such a big deal. Some people, when they think of Jupyter, they mostly think of this notebook interface of kind of interleaving little bits of code, visualizations, text, whatever else it might be. Clearly, that's a popular interface and people like it, but the really thing that, Mathematica does that. The reason that Jupyter is different is that it gives you that notebook interface inside a web browser. And because the web browser technology is what we need to build these remote data access and visualization tools, means that Jupyter is a platform that we can actually use to build on this. And what's really great is that the popularity of this platform is really driving an overdue revisitation of the tools that we have in astronomy to visualize data, because so many of the tools that we have are traditionally based on, X windows, basically X windows. And those, X windows is actually a network protocol, but it doesn't do what we need to do for modern data visualization. And so the popularity of Jupyter is causing people to really start building browser-based visualization tools. And I believe wholeheartedly that's what we need to really, do anything with data in the years coming ahead. It's also true that this notebook paradigm gives you a way to think about remote computation, and as you probably have heard, anyone who's got a large, data set archive that they want people to do computations on, this science platform concept that Vera Rubin will have, that what I wrote here, NOAO, now Noir Lab, will have. Everyone is building around Jupyter because it's a nice paradigm for that. Now, I think it's actually kind of a problematic paradigm in some ways. If this were an in-person conference, this would be where I'd say, ask me over beers and I'll talk your ear off. But that being aside, this is clearly the foundation that we want. And when we go look at our Jupyter notebooks, this is what I want you to keep in mind. Visualization has to happen through the browser, and Jupyter is the tool that we're using right now. Fortunately, even if Jupyter goes away, the browser-based tools that we've built will remain relevant. So with that being said, let's go back to our browsers and see what we've got. All right, so we'll start out by visualizing some imagery in the Jupyter environment using the WorldWide Telescope Python module, PyWT. So in the screen here, I've got the Dirac Institute Astro Hack Week Jupyter Lab environment that's opened up, Jupyter environment that's opened up. We're in the kind of traditional one, not Jupyter Lab. If you're not involved in the Hack Week and you're using the MyBinder approach, we'll sync up with that shortly. So the first thing that I'll do here is I'll repeat what I showed before and edit the URL and type in lab instead to get us to the Jupyter Lab environment. And you'll see this kind of thing here. And for this workshop, we're going to use some canned notebooks that have most of the code and examples already filled in, and so we'll fetch those. The easiest way to do it here is to open up a terminal, so I'll click on that. And these notebooks are located in the WorldWide Telescope GitHub organization, and so we can just pull them down with a simple git pull. So here I'll do a git clone https github.com/worldwide-telescope/pywt-notebooks.git. That looks okay. We'll clone that, and then actually, I think momentarily you should see it show up in the folder browser here. There it goes. So that's all that we need to do here, so we can exit this terminal. We can click on this folder, and then we'll go to the Start Here notebook. Pull this open. And so actually, when I was preparing this, I discovered a small but very annoying and tedious bug in the interaction between PyWT and the environment that we're using here, which broke some of the things I wanted to show. So from here on out, I'll actually switch over to the Binder Hub instance, which should be identical. So the bug fix should be in by the time that you are looking at this tutorial if you are at Astro Hack Week, but for right now I need to switch over. So if I do that, we'll see an extremely similar interface. So I'll open up the Start Here again. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at the Visualizing Imagery notebook, which is linked from here. So if I click down that, we'll pull that open. And to get a little bit more screen real estate, the first thing I'll do is I'll click on this folder icon to collapse that side pane, and then I'll maximize this window to get a little bit more space. So the first thing that we always do is we do our imports and set up our basic context here. So we have a few commands built in to do that. So this will import the class of the widget icon that we use to display our data. And that should take a moment to run. Alright, it's taking slightly more than a moment. I wonder how my kernel is doing. Yeah, let's just restart the kernel. Alright, let's try that again. There we go. I had this notebook open before, so there might have been something funky there. We'll define a little function that will help us get our data abstractly. And then here's the most important couple of lines thus far, where we'll create a variable called WWT, which is one of these widget instances, and then we'll quote-unquote print it out. But because this special class is wired into Jupyter's display infrastructure, instead of getting a textual representation, we'll get an actual WWT interactive widget. So if we do that, you'll see some things flashing, and this might look like you've got kind of a big black box here, but if you look in the corner over here, you'll see a couple of things, and if I click and drag, we see that this is, in fact, a kind of Google Maps-like interface to the sky. Now, the aspect ratio of this is obviously a little bit awkward, so we're going to pop this out into its own tab, which is something that you can only do in Jupyter Lab as opposed to stock Jupyter, which is why we're very interested in using the Jupyter Lab environment. So if I move my mouse over here to this sort of left gutter and right click, or I think it's a control click on a Mac, I can get a context menu, and then I'll click on this Create New View for Output button. So what this will do is this will open up a new tab that's split down here, emulating the view that we've got. So if I go back and click on this blue sidebar here, that should hide the original view. Then I'll move down to this widget and click and drag horizontally over to this other side here. And if I do things, if I get it about right, I'll start getting previews of how Jupyter might want to rearrange things. And if I get it to this position, we'll split things laterally. And I find this to be generally a pretty good setup. So I'm going to try and move this pane over a little bit to equalize things. Jupyter's resizing seems to be very finicky when you do that, so hopefully it will be okay and I won't regret it. Stop there. Okay, hopefully that was fine. So, if I click and drag here, we'll pan through the sky, and because I'm streaming and recording at the same time as rendering things in Jupyter, this will be a little bit laggy. Hopefully yours should be smoother, but hopefully you can see right here, we've got Orion, nice and familiar. And if I zoom way in, you'll see that we're streaming progressively higher resolution data, and there's a nice little Horsehead Nebula for you. And so this is the kind of technology that's built in the WorldWide Telescope, where we take a very high resolution data set, we downsample it, and we tile it into chunks, and we stream them dynamically, which, you know, your typical DS9 image viewing software just isn't built to view. And when your image can fit in memory and it lives on your local machine, that's fine. But when we have big images that live on the other side of the internet, that's when this kind of more sophisticated approach becomes necessary. So the first thing that we'll do here is we'll just open up a FITS file that was stored in the Git repository, so it's now a local file on your account here. And so within the WWT object, there's this layers sub-object, and we have a function add image layer, and the argument there is just a path to a file, and we have this data path function which abstracts the access to the data that's associated with this repository. So if we run that, we'll spin for a moment. So what has to happen here is we have to load up the FITS file and actually transfer it to the JavaScript code that's running the visualization that we have here. And then we'll zoom out and pan over to where this image lives. So this is FITS data corresponding to the W5 star forming region or something. So now we have this layer object, which we get from a result of this, which lets us control the visualization of the image. So if we just run layer.controls, This will pop up some widgets that let us affect how the image is displayed. And so right now, okay, so we've got a color map, and we can change that maybe from Viridis to the nicely named Inferno. We can change the stretch. I don't know, let's make it a log stretch. And we can also change the opacity of this image and view it against the background imagery. And right now the default background image is kind of a composite of optical data from the Digitized Sky Survey, which mostly emphasizes kind of stuff that looks good. But there's several different background data sets that you can choose from. So the way that we control the bounds is kind of a two-step process here. So there's a coarse and a fine minimum maximum. So the fine minimum maximum controls are these sliders that you can pull around, which will affect how things are displayed. And the coarse controls affect the bounds of these sliders, because often in astronomy images with high dynamic ranges, if we just gave you these sliders down here, it would be extremely difficult to adjust anything. So let's just change that to like 430 just to make it nice and round. And so you can see here the coarse max is 7,400, whereas the fine max is just 800. So that means that there's a few pixels with very high values that set this coarse value, but that, you know, we don't need them for this particular visualization. So if I reduce this to a much smaller number, make it say 850, then suddenly I have a lot more control in these sliders. I can pull this around and change the stretch that we've got here. And you'll note that if we cut the low value off, the image becomes transparent where it's cut off, which is kind of cool. So this is basic visualization of a FITS file. And one thing that's important to note is that we've got widgets that let us control these settings kind of interactively, but they're also controllable programmatically. This is using the IPy widgets infrastructure, which powers a lot more things than just PyWWT. So we can run code that will alter these things, you know, using code instead of interactive items. And so here we just have some preset defaults. If I run that, it will update everything to whatever these defaults give. So that's sort of basic loading and exploring a FITS file, just tuning the parameters of how it's rendered on the sky. And so we have this reset function attached to the WWT widget that will, in fact, reset it. So one thing I want to show is that, so that was operating with a FITS file that lives on the local machine. Given what I've been talking about with how data are going remote, one thing I wanted to demonstrate is that we don't necessarily need to work with our local machine. We can use services to pull down data on the fly instead. Now, if you're running a notebook, say, on some server associated with LSST, then data might actually appear as local files. This is a nice opportunity to show off the Astro Query package, which is super helpful. So here we have some pre-canned code that will pull down a 2-mass image of the location of supernova 2011 FE. So this will usually take a little minute to run because we do have to go to the Skyview servers, do a query for images, pull down the actual data, and then we're actually digesting it as a FITS file here. So we print out image, and we've got an HDU, and we've specified it to just be 500 pixels on the side to make life easy. So what we've got here is an AstroPy FITS object, and we can add that as an image layer just the way that we would add a FITS file given by its path. So if we do that, once again, we'll load the image into the JavaScript that's running over here, and it will pan over and zoom in on that image. And one thing that's worth mentioning is, you know, the sort of like slow pan and zoom effect, you know, feels maybe it's like a little bit more, you know, squishy, I don't know, but it's actually an important part of the user experience, because if we just zoomed right over to where this image was exactly, we would have to pull down all the data of the high resolution contextual imagery. You know, you wouldn't see anything, and then you'd slowly see that high resolution imagery fill in after the fact. And by zooming more gradually, we give the browser a little bit of time to pull down that data, and so it ends up being a little bit nicer in terms of how you perceive it. You can, though, force it to zoom instantly if that's what you'd rather have. So here we'll demonstrate a couple of options which will control the background imagery behind this. So the background field is something that is sort of an enumeration of different possible image sets that we have. And here we'll set the background imagery to 2mass. And so you'll see this disappear and then gradually tile in to higher resolution as we download the data, although 2mass has a lower fundamental resolution than this DSS all-sky optical survey that we have, so it doesn't look quite as nice in the end. If you want to play around with this background contextual imagery, you can create this layer controls object. So if we run this cell, this will give you a couple of drop-down lists and a slider, and so actually it's possible to load multiple, by multiple I mean exactly 2 background image sets and kind of mix between them and then show your data on top. So here the 2 options that we've got right now are 2mass and the digitized sky survey, and the blender is all the way to 2mass. If we put that in the middle, it will kind of mix between them a little bit, but we can pull out a lot of other choices. So here you can see we've got actually quite lengthy list. So most of these things are relatively low resolution compared to a typical optical image. Just all sky data sets where a lot of these they're only in this list if they do cover a substantial portion of the sky, and that's just a fairly finite list of options. But I don't know, so we can pull out like the SFD dust map, and then we'll tile in a little bit, and we'll move the slider over closer to that. Now if we zoom out, so I'm using the scroll wheel to zoom in and out here, so you can see that we can zoom way out and see kind of the very large dust structure around this image. That's not particularly scientifically important here, but it is really a nice image to explore. And likewise, besides having interactive widgets to control these things, you can also control them programmatically. So here we'll set these parameters, and so if I run that cell, you should also note that the widgets here update to track the settings that we've applied here, which is just a cool aspect of the IPyWidgets library, where these graphical widgets and the underlying code are all linked together in a way that keeps them in sync. So finally, we have another local fits file, and we can add that on too. And so there's only 2 options at once for kind of the all-sky background imagery, but you can load as many image layers as you'd like. And so this image happens to overlap on top of the previous image, so it's completely replaced it, but we can pull open controls that let us affect all these. So say I bump down the opacity of the Swift image, and now we can see, there are some sources here that are X-ray sources, and there are some sources that are, IR sources, and only a handful that are both at once. And this kind of overlaying images from different wavelengths, especially very different wavelengths, is where this kind of interface really excels, because mapping the all-sky data is something that, the infrastructure here lets you combine several images on top of each other with opacity and custom scalings and things like that. And a typical image viewer, it might be a little bit more tedious to pull all the data together overlapped in the same way, even though we don't have pixel level statistics or histograms or that kind of thing yet, for the kind of DS9 like analysis that you might do if you really want to go in depth on a specific image that you have. What we've got right here is more optimized for look at the large scale structure and combining lots of different data sets. So you can see down here that we've gotten to the end of this first notebook, and so this has walked you through some of the things that you can do to visualize imagery in a Jupyter environment. And for tutorials where there's a live person who will be here to answer questions, I want to give just a little bit of dead time for question answering and dealing with any problems. So I'm just going to play around with these buttons for a minute or two, not going to say anything, and so now it's the perfect time to tune out from this video and pay attention to the chat or whatever else is going on, if that's in fact going on. Or you can just watch me play with the knobs. Alright, I think that's enough of that. Let's move on to the next section. Alright, for the last part of this workshop, I want to talk a little bit about how these web-based visualizations that we've been looking at can be remixed into a broader ecosystem than just what we've got in Jupyter. And I think that's something that's pretty exciting, and that's going to be really important as this ecosystem gets developed out. So one great example of that I'd like to start with is talking about interactive figures. So the AAS journals support interactive figures, which are, as they might sound, you read an article and there's things that are dynamic instead of static. And what's going on under the hood is they're just HTML in an iframe. So, all the technologies that we're using to create visualizations in Jupyter can be ported right into that kind of context, and we can start building a world where we can explore data in papers much more dynamically than we've been able to from a world where our papers were printed out on square pieces of dead trees. So to take a look at that, we'll start by visiting a website that's called astroexplorer.org, A-S-T-R-O explorer.org. So this is the Astronomy Image Explorer, which is kind of like an ADS for images in papers. And we've got a faceted search on the left here, and to find interactive figures, I can just apply this selector. You can see compared to the total number of images, interactive figures are definitely still relatively rare, but I do think this will be increasing in the future, and the more tools that we can give people to create these kinds of interactive figures, the more exciting content we're going to see. So I'll just set a little year slider so that I can get things that are open access here. So I'll try clicking on this one because I like the fact that it's from something called Clamato. So this is kind of a landing page for the image in this article. And then let's see, we're figure 11. So if I view this article, we'll pull it up in the AppJ online version. Start scrolling. We'll find it in the article here. And so the way that these work is for accessibility reasons, there's always a non-interactive version of one of these figures, which I will talk a little bit more later. But there is this nice button, Start Interaction, which will boot up this interactive figure and start rendering it. Okay, there we go. And so this looks like sort of a standard 3D visualizer, kind of the same sort of controls as WorldWide Telescope, so I can change the view and zoom in and out. And honestly, I have no idea what I'm looking at scientifically here, but looks like we can turn on and off a few ISO surfaces to get a better idea of what the data in this article are like. So there's already some work underway to try and integrate Jupyter workflows with these kind of interactive figures that you can get into a final published article. So I'll close these out. And so one important tool is what's called the AAS time series tool, which is a Jupyter widget package specifically for interactive visualization of time series data. Now we didn't get that installed here, so I'm going to show off what we've got with some of PyWWT again. So if we go back to the start page for the WWT sample notebooks, in the tutorials that we've got here, we've got this one labeled Creating Interactive Figures. So I'll go ahead and click on that, or you could also just open it up by clicking in the left-hand tab instead. So we'll get started in the same way as we've seen before of importing the widget modules and having a little utility function that will help us pull up data. There is an important distinction in this example. Due to some technical limitations that we have right now, if you try and do the Jupyter pop-out into a side pane thing, it will actually break the interactive figure export that we're going to do. So we're just going to leave this up here for now. So all this demo is going to do is we're going to repeat some of the steps that we saw in the imaging tutorial, and we'll add an image. And so if you were to use PyWWT in a stock Jupyter environment without the Jupyter Lab support, this is what the experience would be more like, where you do stuff down here and then you kind of have to scroll up and see what's going on. Did I lose my image? All right, we'll just re-add it because I think I scrolled away from the image when I ran that code. Let's be a little more careful this time. Why are you not working? Commands finished executing. Got sensible default. Okay, I have no idea why it took so long to scroll over there. Well, let's proceed. That was a little bit odd. I don't know why that took so long. So, as before, we can play with some of the settings here. Maybe choose a square root map. And anyways, like Inferno. So get our image all set up. And now there's a function attached to this WWT widget called Save as HTML Bundle, which will take the view that we've set up here and export it as you might guess from the argument here, a zip file that contains some HTML and JavaScript that will reproduce the view that we've got there. So if we run this, it will spin, and you'll see over here a figure.zip file has just appeared in the Jupyter Lab directory. What's cool is I can right-click on this and download it, and it will save to my local machine, so I can create one of these bundles without even having to install PyWWT locally. You know, this is all running on the mybinder.org. So I will open up this file, if I can grab the window. Now you might be shocked to seeing me use Windows because I'm a diehard Linux guy, but for this simultaneous screencasting, it seemed like the safest way to go. So we'll unpack this zip file into the current directory. So if you download this on a Linux machine, you can just use unzip in the command line, or on Macs, I'm sure there's something similar. And if we go in here, we'll see that this is an index.html file, and there's some JSON data, and there's some support scripts and support data. And one thing that I want to point out is inside this data directory, we have the FITS files that underlay the imagery that we saw. And when you upload an interactive figure to the journal, your upload includes this bundle. And so that means that we're actually preserving the FITS file as opposed to just, a picture that was derived from it. So just as a quick demo of what's actually going on here, so if you were to submit your interactive figure to a journal, you would just send them the zip file and a little bit of extra information, and it would get embedded inside your online journal article. We can view what this would be like now with our own machine by setting up a little temporary HTTP server. So if you've got a Conda environment, what you can do, there's all sorts of ways to sort of create like a little one-line HTTP server that serves files from a directory. And one point to note is that you generally need to use one of these little one-liner servers instead of just clicking on the HTML in your Explorer, because of the way that web browsers manage permissions, where things loaded from like local file / yada 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 actually can't do some of the things that are needed for some of this. So I will go into my download directory if I can type it correctly, and I'm not in bash. And the command that I generally like is if you have node.js installed, you can do npx http-server and just dot to tell it to serve files from the current directory. So in Python, there's an equivalent command which might be more likely to be installed on your machine. There's a million of them. This one is a nice one-liner, and it gets some of the kind of the kind of extras right, like the content type markings on the files, and that helps some applications. So if I run this, it will tell me, okay, I can visit these addresses to open up the interactive figure. And I didn't actually pay attention to what the port was. 8080, unsurprising. And there we go. So here's this HTML fragment that, this is what people would see if you submitted this as an interactive figure in your article and they clicked through on it. And, in some ways, unlike a JPEG, I can zoom in and see the fine detail. And what we don't support here is some of the more sophisticated controls for changing the stretch or say downloading the underlying FITS file. But that's just because this is sort of like a proof of concept demo set of HTML files, and we've actually been building out more sophisticated support for that. So as to see a slightly nicer version, we have something. So if I go to another short link of bit.ly, bit.ly/WWT-M33, as in the Triangulum Galaxy. This will take us to a slightly next generation embed of the Hubble mosaic out of Julianne Dalcanton's group at UW Washington, of the Triangulum Galaxy, the same folks who did the panchromatic Hubble Andromeda survey. And here, so this image that we're looking at here is a few gigapixels, something like that. And again, this is sort of an embed that by default is in the full screen. And I can zoom way in, and my computer will gradually tile in the high resolution imagery. Especially it'd be nice if it pulled this particular tile. And you can explore, every single one of those billions of pixels in your web browser at your leisure. And I don't know if you could tell here, but this is still not at its full resolution because my computer is struggling with all the graphics. So up here we've got a little, oh no, you can't see it because of my face. So there's a little hamburger menu that you can click on. And I can click on something that says crossfade, which will open up a crossfader control down here and let me fade between the Hubble imagery and the background context, which is pan stars. And so this is the kind of thing where you can show people, all right, this is what we had before, and this is what Hubble gets for us. And we also got a control to change the background imagery. So if you don't want to compare it against pan stars, you can compare it against a slightly more restricted list than we had in the previous example, where I can pull up Galax here and see if there's anything to see. It might be in a gap. So talking about what I mentioned before, where one of the things that's really great about all this is because the web is such a ubiquitous platform, you can really plug and play things like this in a variety of locations. So for instance, I know that if I go to the Worldwide Telescope forum, wwt-forum.org, we will slowly pull that up. And down here, we have a forum post that embeds the same interactive visualization right inside this forum. And so this is using the same kind of HTML iframe that is in the AppJ interactive articles. You can add it to your personal website with a few lines of HTML. You can include it in your observatory's PR feed or your press releases. And this is the kind of thing that only is possible because of the visualization technology built into the web. I mean, it's one of these things where the barrier to entry to building this kind of, essentially the web is so high that there's only one of them, and so everything's interoperable, which ends up being really great for us. And one thing I should point out is that, so this image right now is clearly like an RGP, basically a JPEG, except billions of pixels, which you can't easily do that way. Whereas what I was showing before is FITS images. We do currently have a limitation in PyWWT that the FITS images don't get tiled in the same way that these RGB images do. So we do have a size limitation of you couldn't look at an entire LSST tract at once. But we actually just got an NSF grant to support the work that will kind of mash up these two capabilities of the tiling and the FIT support and build the technology for interactive visualization of the raw data, not just the data converted to RGB values. So as I start wrapping up, I wanted to switch back to my slides here and just mention a few takeaway points. So as I was just saying, web visualizations are great for mashups. And in fact, I do my slides in HTML. So the same thing that I've been showing you over and over again, I can also embed right in my talks. And I've also, if you're handy with some of the other JavaScript data visualization tools, you can create interactive plots or other things that let you really express stuff a lot more dynamically than you could using standard PowerPoint. And so this is done using a framework called reveal.js, and it even supports like a presenter preview and PDF export, and that was kind of the level of sophistication where I was like, all right, I feel comfortable doing my slides this way as opposed to doing it using a standard presentation software. And yeah, I challenge you to create this kind of experience in PowerPoint. It is true that these new tools require us to develop new data standards. I'm a very big proponent of thinking about, the underlying format of the data that we use really does matter, and we need to be thoughtful about what we construct. Historically, astronomy has done very well. Um, FITS has been around for 40 years for a reason. It works really well. But as we get into this new paradigm of remote data visualization, we do need new standards, and they are going to have to be much more complicated. So the figure here is kind of a very schematic representation of how we tile images in WorldWide Telescope, where this is what everyone does for when you have to deal with this gigapixel image regime of you break your image up into little chunks and ship around only the ones that you need. But more broadly, if you're talking about a data cube or a time stream of visibilities or whatever it might be, we're going to need to develop similar new, more sophisticated approaches. And the analogy that I like is, to show a video, you can have a directory full of ping files for individual frames, but in practice, we need MPEG to really do real work. And MPEG is a very, very complicated interlocking set of standards. But when you get to the sort of data regime that we're getting to in astronomy, that's what you need. Of course, it is true that all these web technologies are introducing new demands on expertise, and there's just an inevitable perennial issue of trying to figure out how we're gonna find that expertise and maintain that expertise. As an astronomer, I personally know a lot about this stuff. We probably don't want every astronomer to have to learn web technologies to this depth, and could we even do that? No one's sitting around full of free time, and so if you spend more time learning about this stuff, you have to spend less time learning about something else. On the other hand, we all love interdisciplinarity, but in practice, it's really hard, and it's really hard to find situations where two people coming from different communities, like web development and astronomy or visualization or whatever it might be, it's very hard to find a situation where both people really feel like they're getting something valuable out of it. I think the potential is there because astronomy offers a lot of really fun, interesting data challenges, and we're going to need to solve them, but it's hard. Another thing to be mindful of is that as we build these more sophisticated technologies, they do become more fragile. That's what the last word in this slide is saying. And so this plot here is, you can probably guess, it's kind of URLs published in scholarly articles, I think specific to astronomy, as a function of time and how many of the URLs are still functioning. And so you see that this study was published in 2014. As you go back a decade, you get to 1/3, close to 1/2 of all the URLs are broken. And we're generally aware of this problem, but it's not specific to URLs. In general, WorldWide Telescope is a complex ecosystem of software. You've got a lot of data streaming around. That is harder to keep stable than, okay, here's a JPEG file, this is my image, that's it. And I think we're going to need to develop a sort of defense in depth of, these more sophisticated visualizations are definitely valuable, but they are fragile. And so we're going to need to, build systems that preserve them as well as we can, but also provide fallbacks in the, case that inevitably some fraction of them, the supporting technologies, are going to fall apart. Another thing that I said I would come back to is accessibility. So this is another genuine problem that is genuinely hard to solve. There's people have all sorts of disabilities of varying degrees, and it's really important that the things that we build are accessible to as many people as possible. So whether it be color blindness or other forms of vision impairment, or say for any of these interactives, some people don't have very good fine motor control, and so if you build something that requires a lot of precise clicking, that can be very hard to use. And this is another sort of expertise where we already know from our own experience that most astronomers are not experts in building figures that are colorblind finally, which is possibly one of the easiest of these challenges to work on. And I would love if every astronomer was really well versed in all of these issues, but that's just a whole new area of expertise that, again, is competing for mind space with everything else. That being said, we should the things that we are looking at here are really great, powerful, new, exciting new tools. What it says up here in the corner is, we have these new immensely powerful tools, and we can use it to explore data like we haven't before. And I think especially if you can build a team that assembles all the different kinds of expertise that are really needed to push this field forward, I think there's going to be some really great rewards, just because we're getting more data than we know how to work with, and the way to know how to work with it is to get better at exploring our data, understanding our data. So I'm really looking forward to what we're going to see in the future. So that's it. I've got a couple of the key links here for you to peruse. Normally this would be the point when I would ask you for questions. If this is one of the Astro Hack Week seminars and I'm in the chat, then that certainly is the time. If it's not one of those contexts, then thank you for watching all the way through this, and feel free to get in touch. Here's some of my contact information, and happy visualizing.